It was just another ordinary afternoon for Big Shaq. The sun was bright, and the world seemed to be moving at a steady pace. Shaq, known for his quick wit and larger-than-life personality, had decided to step into a local McDonald's. He wasn't there for anything special, just a quick meal to fuel up before getting back to his busy day. The aroma of fresh fries and burgers filled the air, making his stomach growl in anticipation. Shaq strolled into the restaurant, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. He wasn't looking to draw attention to himself today. He just wanted some peace and quiet. But as always, people recognized him. A few fans gave him quick smiles and waves, but he simply nodded back, not wanting to make a fuss. After all, he was just like everyone else when he was off the stage and out of the spotlight. He found a small booth near the corner, away from the bustle of the counter and the play area. It was quiet, peaceful, the perfect place to enjoy his food without being interrupted. He placed his order, a classic meal, fries, a burger, and a drink, and waited for it to be ready. As he sat down, Shaq couldn't help but smile to himself. There was something about the simple things in life, like grabbing a quick meal in a fast food joint, that brought a sense of normalcy. It was a nice break from the chaos of his celebrity life, a moment of solitude in the middle of a busy world. As he picked up his fries and began eating, he noticed the noise around him. A group of kids running around, laughing and shouting as they played in the restaurant's play area. It was the usual hustle and bustle of a McDonald's, and Shaq didn't mind it one bit. In fact, he found it somewhat comforting. There was something about the sounds of children playing that made everything feel a little lighter. He took another bite of his burger, savoring the taste. Life had its ups and downs, but in this moment, everything felt calm. Just as he was about to take a sip of his drink, a small voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me," the voice said softly. Shaq paused, looking around surprised. He hadn't seen anyone approach his booth. Then, looking down, he saw a small child standing beside him, looking up with wide eyes. Shaq blinked, taken aback by the sudden appearance of the boy. The child couldn't have been more than 6 years old. He was dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, and he had an innocent, almost angelic expression on his face. But there was something in the way the boy was staring at him, something that made Shaq feel uneasy. The boy didn't say anything more at first. He simply stood there, watching Shaq. Shaq couldn't help but feel a bit uncomfortable under the child's gaze. He smiled politely and was about to ask if the boy needed something, when, without warning, the child leaned in closer. "Big Shaq," the boy whispered, "they're coming for you." Shaq froze, his fries halfway to his mouth. He thought he'd misheard, but no. The boy had spoken clearly, and those words hung in the air between them, almost as if they carried a weight. Shaq chuckled nervously, unsure whether to take the boy seriously or not. It was just a kid, right? Probably just saying random things. But for some reason, the words felt different, heavier than they should have been. What?" Shaq asked, trying to play it cool. He looked around the restaurant, but nothing seemed out of place. The kids were still playing, and the staff was busy behind the counter, as usual. Yet the boy's whisper left an unsettling feeling in the air. The boy didn't say anything else. He just turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of children without looking back. Shaq sat there for a moment, processing what had just happened. He tried to laugh it off, but a strange sense of unease began to creep into his mind. Something about that encounter didn't sit right with him. It was just a whisper, but it was one that seemed to echo in his thoughts. He shook his head, deciding it was probably nothing, just a strange moment. After all, children said all sorts of things, but as he returned to his meal, the feeling of unease lingered in the pit of his stomach, growing stronger with every passing second. After this strange encounter with the boy, Big Shaq tried to push the feeling aside. He told himself it was nothing more than a kid being a little odd. It was probably just a random comment, something that didn't mean much. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Shaq took a deep breath and looked around the McDonald's again, hoping the normal hustle and bustle of the place would help calm his nerves. The children in the play area were still running around, laughing and shouting, just like before. The staff was busy working, and the sound of orders being called out filled the air. Everything seemed normal, but his mind couldn't stop replaying the boy's words. "They're coming for you." What did it mean? Who was coming for him? The words made no sense, but something about the way the boy said them made Shaq feel like they weren't just the random thoughts of a 6-year-old. It was as if the boy had known something that Shaq wasn't aware of. Shaq glanced around the restaurant again, scanning the faces of the people inside. There was nothing unusual about anyone, just the usual customers enjoying their meals, a few parents keeping an eye on their kids, and the staff running the place. Still, he couldn't help but feel like he was being watched. He took another bite of his burger, trying to focus on the task at hand. After all, he was here to relax, not to get caught up in strange thoughts. But his mind kept wandering back to the boy and his cryptic message. As he finished his meal, Shaq noticed that the little boy was no longer in the play area. He looked around, hoping to spot him again. Maybe it would make more sense if he could talk to the kid and ask him what he meant. But no sign of him anywhere. It was as if the boy had vanished into thin air. Just then, a group of men entered the restaurant. They were dressed casually, but something about the way they carried themselves caught Shaq's attention. It wasn't the way they looked. It was the way they moved. There was a certain confidence in their step, a kind of quiet power that felt out of place in a place like McDonald's. Shaq tried to brush it off, but he couldn't help but notice how their eyes seemed to be scanning the room, as if they were looking for someone or something. As they walked past him, one of the men glanced at Shaq, their eyes locking for just a brief second. The man's look was intense, like he knew exactly who Shaq was. Shaq felt a shiver run down his spine. He quickly turned his attention back to his phone, pretending to check a text message. But inside, he was already starting to feel uneasy again. What was going on? Was it just his imagination, or was there something more happening here? He'd been in situations before where things didn't feel quite right, but this time, it was different. The air felt heavier, and every little detail seemed to stand out more than usual. Shaq tried to convince himself it was nothing. After all, he was just a normal guy grabbing lunch at a fast food restaurant. But his instincts were starting to kick in, telling him to be cautious. There was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind, telling him that something strange was happening right under his nose. He sat there for a few moments, trying to shake off the feeling, but it only seemed to grow stronger. The men who had entered were now sitting at a table not too far from him, talking quietly among themselves. Shaq could hear snippets of their conversation, but nothing that really stood out. They seemed perfectly ordinary, but still, something felt off. It wasn't until one of them glanced at Shaq again that the feeling in his gut grew even more intense. Something about the way they were looking at him. It wasn't just recognition. It felt like they were waiting for something. Waiting for him, perhaps. Shaq stood up quickly, his heart racing, but before he could leave the booth, he felt his phone buzz in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from an unknown number. "He's here. He's watching you." The words on the screen made Shaq's blood run cold. The message was clear. Whoever it was, they were watching him. And that feeling of being observed, that sense of something wrong, was no longer in his head. It was real. Shaq's heart began to race. His phone still gripped tightly in his hand. He read the text again. "He's here. He's watching you." The words seemed to pulse on the screen, echoing in his mind. He didn't know who was sending the messages or why they were sending them. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just some random coincidence. Something was happening, and it wasn't good. Shaq tried to remain calm, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The men who had walked in earlier were now scattered around the restaurant, but Shaq could sense that they were aware of him. There was something unsettling about their presence. They weren't looking at him directly, but there was an underlying tension in the air. It felt like they were waiting for something to happen. As Shaq sat there, trying to act normal, he found his eyes drifting to the boy again. The little kid, the one who had whispered those strange words to him. Where had he gone? Was he still in the restaurant? Shaq had hoped that seeing the boy again would bring some clarity, but there was no sign of him. It was as if the child had disappeared. His thoughts kept spinning, unable to land on anything concrete. He looked back at the group of men, who were now sitting in a booth near the back of the restaurant. They were talking quietly among themselves, but Shaq couldn't help but feel that they were keeping an eye on him. Maybe it was just his paranoia, but something felt off about this entire situation. Trying to focus on something else, Shaq took a deep breath and grabbed another fry from his tray. He shoved it into his mouth without really tasting it. His mind was too consumed by the strange events unfolding around him. He had been in plenty of crazy situations before, but this one felt different. The weight of it was heavy, almost suffocating. As he glanced around the room again, a strange thought crossed his mind. What if this wasn't just some random encounter? What if it was a setup? Maybe the men had been watching him before he even entered the restaurant. Maybe they had known he'd be here, and they were waiting for the right moment to make their move. Shaq's pulse quickened at the thought. He had dealt with his fair share of strange situations in his life, but none quite like this. And as if on cue, the text message came through again. They're closer than you think. The message made him feel even more on edge. Who were they? Who was sending these messages? The question spun in his mind like a whirlwind, but there were no answers, only more confusion. Shaq glanced at the group of men once again. This time, they weren't just sitting quietly. They were now standing up, looking around the restaurant in a more purposeful way. One of them had his eyes fixed on the door, as if waiting for someone to walk in. Shaq's gut twisted. He was starting to feel like he was in the middle of something he didn't understand. He stood up, trying to act casual, but his legs felt like jelly. Something wasn't right. He needed to get out of there, fast. He glanced at the exit, weighing his options, but as he started to move toward the door, he caught sight of the boy again. This time, the child was standing near the entrance, staring at him with those wide, intense eyes. Shaq froze, and the boy's gaze seemed to lock onto his. For a moment, everything around Shaq went silent. The noise of the McDonald's, the chatter, the laughter, it all faded away. All that was left was the boy's eyes, watching him with an unnerving focus. The message from the boy echoed in Shaq's mind. They're coming for you. It wasn't just a strange comment anymore. It was a warning. A warning that was starting to make sense in ways Shaq couldn't fully grasp yet. The boy slowly turned and began walking out the door without a word, his tiny footsteps fading into the distance. Shaq stood there, frozen for a moment. Should he follow him? Or should he leave while he still could? He didn't know what to do. The boy's disappearance, the strange group of men, the cryptic texts, they were all connected in a way that he couldn't fully understand. One thing was clear. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than him, and he needed to figure it out before it was too late. Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His instincts were screaming at him to leave, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The boy had just walked out the door, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed to hang in the air. Shaq's heart was racing, and his mind was spinning. What had just happened? What was that warning about? And who were these people watching him? The group of men who had been sitting nearby were now standing near the counter, their conversation quiet but intense. They didn't seem to be in a hurry, but there was a tension about them that Shaq couldn't ignore. He glanced at the exit again. He wanted to leave. He needed to leave. But something made him hesitate. He pulled out his phone once more, checking for any new messages. His thumb hovered over the screen, and he saw another text pop up. They found you. The text sent a chill down his spine. Whoever was behind this, whoever was sending him these cryptic messages, They were getting closer. But the question remained, who were they? Shaq quickly typed a message back, his hands shaking. Who is this? What do you want from me? He hit send, but the response never came. Instead, he found himself staring at the same empty screen. There was no new message, no clue as to who was behind this strange and growing sense of danger. He looked up from his phone and noticed the group of men again. They were no longer standing by the counter. Now, they were looking at the door, as if waiting for something. Shaq's eyes darted to the exit, his thoughts racing. Could they be waiting for him? Did they know that he knew something? He felt like he was in the middle of a strange game, and no one was telling him the rules. His mind flashed to the boy's words. They're coming for you. Was he the target? Had something about him made him a part of whatever strange situation was unfolding in the restaurant? Before he could think too much about it, his phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. It wasn't from the same unknown number, but from a name he recognized. It was a text from one of his close friends, someone he trusted. The message was short. Get out of there. Trust no one. Shaq's stomach turned. It wasn't the first time his friend had warned him about things he shouldn't be involved in, but this time it felt more urgent than ever. The weight of the warning was real, too real. His friend knew something was happening, something that Shaq wasn't aware of. Without thinking, Shaq grabbed his things and stood up. His mind told him to leave, to get out of there before things got worse. But as he started walking toward the door, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. One of the men, the one who had looked at him earlier, was now walking toward him. His eyes locked onto Shaq's. The man's face was calm, but there was something about his expression that made Shaq's heart skip a beat. It wasn't a friendly look. It was the kind of gaze someone gives when they know exactly who you are, when they know you're a part of something much bigger than you ever imagined. Shaq froze in place. He could feel the man's eyes on him, and he knew that the situation had gone from strange to dangerous. He wanted to turn around and run, but the feeling of being trapped was suffocating. The man stopped just a few feet away from him, his presence suddenly overwhelming. For a moment, everything around Shaq seemed to fade into the background. It was just him and this man, standing face to face in the middle of a busy McDonald's. But it didn't feel normal. Shaq's pulse was racing. He wasn't sure what the man wanted, but the way he was looking at him, like he was the key to something, made him feel like he was in too deep. Whatever this was, whatever game was being played, Shaq didn't know the rules, but it was clear he was a part of it now. Before Shaq could say anything, the man turned and walked back to his group. The tension in the air was thick, and Shaq could feel his own fear rising. He had to get out of here, but the path to the door seemed longer now, more uncertain. He was being watched, and he didn't know by who or why. The boy's warning echoed in his mind once again. They're coming for you. And now, Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that the they was closer than ever. Shaq could feel his heart pounding in his chest. His feet were moving on their own, but his mind was racing in 1,000 different directions. The man had just walked away, but the tension in the air was still thick, almost unbearable. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something big. He needed answers, but he wasn't sure where to find them. His hands were shaking as he gripped his phone, trying to think clearly. His mind kept going back to the boy, the mysterious text messages, and the group of men who seemed to be watching his every move. What did all of this mean? Who were these people, and why were they so interested in him? As he made his way toward the door, his eyes darted around the restaurant, looking for any sign of danger. The place seemed normal, with people enjoying their meals and children playing in the corner. But Shaq couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. He wasn't alone in this. There were eyes on him, too many eyes. Just as he was about to step outside, his phone buzzed again. This time, the message was from a different number. It read, "You're not safe. Leave now." Shaq's heart skipped a beat. Who was this? And why were they warning him? The urgency in the message felt real. too real. His gut told him that something was closing in on him, something he wasn't prepared for. But leaving the restaurant wasn't as simple as it seemed. He didn't know who he could trust, or if he could trust anyone at all. Shaq stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. He could hear the faint sound of the children laughing in the play area, but it only made the situation feel more surreal. It was as if he were trapped in a strange dream, one where nothing made sense, and every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into danger. His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. This time, the message was different. It simply said, "He's watching you." Shaq looked up from the screen, his eyes scanning the room once more. His pulse quickened as he saw one of the men, the one who had been watching him earlier, standing near the counter, his eyes locked on Shaq. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching him like a hawk. Shaq felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. The man's gaze was unrelenting, and for a moment, Shaq wondered if he was being set up for something he didn't understand. Was he being targeted? Were these people after him for a reason he didn't know? In that instant, Shaq's mind raced. He had to get out. He had to leave, but the door felt like it was miles away. The man was still staring at him, and now the other members of the group seemed to be moving toward him, closing in slowly, but without a hurry. It was as if they were letting him make the first move. Shaq's instincts kicked in. He wasn't going to wait around to find out what they wanted. He wasn't going to wait for them to make their move. He turned quickly, pushing his way through the door and out into the parking lot. The cool air hit his face like a rush of relief, but his mind was still spinning. His eyes darted around the parking lot, looking for anyone suspicious. He didn't know if he was being followed or if anyone had noticed him yet, but he couldn't risk taking any chances. He headed straight for his car, his steps quick and purposeful. As he approached his car, he felt his phone buzz once more. His hands were shaking as he pulled it out of his pocket. The message was short, and it was from the same unknown number as before. "They know where you are. Run." Shaq's breath caught in his throat. It was as if they were always one step ahead of him, watching his every move. He jumped into his car without hesitation, slamming the door shut behind him. His mind was racing as he started the engine and sped out of the parking lot. But even as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching him. Was he safe now? Or was this just the beginning of something much bigger? Shaq's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove down the empty road. His mind was still reeling from everything that had happened at McDonald's. The strange boy, the cryptic messages, and the group of men who seemed to be following him. It was all too much to process. He had escaped the restaurant, but he didn't feel safe. In fact, he felt more vulnerable than ever. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a car following him. But the road behind was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was as if eyes were on him from every direction. And no matter how fast he drove, it wasn't enough to shake that feeling of being hunted. His phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. Shaq's heart skipped a beat as he saw another text message from the same unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before unlocking his phone and reading it. "You can't escape. They know where you are." The word sent a chill down his spine. They know where you are. It felt like the walls were closing in on him. And no matter how far he ran, they would always find him. It was a terrifying thought, one that made him feel completely helpless. Shaq tried to stay calm, but his thoughts were all over the place. Who were these people? What did they want from him? And most importantly, why was he being targeted? He had never been involved in anything dangerous before. He was just a regular guy trying to live his life. But now, everything had changed. He looked at his phone again, his fingers trembling as he typed a response. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The response came almost instantly. "You'll find out soon enough." Shaq's stomach twisted in knots. The vague answer only left him with more questions. What did that mean? He was driving aimlessly now, his mind running wild with possibilities. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? Or was it something more serious? It didn't feel like a joke. It felt like he was being pulled into something bigger than him, something he didn't understand. As he turned a corner, he saw a car in the distance that seemed to be following him. He didn't think much of it at first, but when he made another turn, the car followed again. It was too much of a coincidence. He wasn't imagining things. Someone was definitely tailing him. Shaq's heart raced as he floored the accelerator, speeding up as the car behind him kept pace. He turned down another street, hoping to lose them, but the car was still there. He wasn't sure if it was the same group of men from the restaurant, or if it was someone else entirely, but the feeling of being hunted was growing stronger with every passing second. He needed to get somewhere safe. He needed to figure out what was going on before it was too late. His mind raced for options, but all he could think of was to keep moving. He glanced at his rearview mirror again, seeing the headlights of the car behind him growing closer. Whoever it was, they weren't giving up. Shaq made another sharp turn, taking a deep breath as he pushed the car to its limits. He couldn't afford to stop now. His mind was filled with the boy's warning, the cryptic messages, and the shadowy figures that seemed to be closing in on him. He couldn't help but feel like this was just the beginning of something much darker. The thought of not knowing who he could trust, of not knowing who was behind all of this, was enough to make him feel like he was losing control. The road ahead seemed endless, but there was no escape from the fear that gripped him. He didn't know how much longer he could keep running, but one thing was certain: whatever was happening, it wasn't over. And it wasn't going to be easy to escape. Shaq's pulse was hammering in his chest as he sped down the winding streets. The car behind him was still there, tailing him closely, and he knew he couldn't keep this up forever. Every corner he turned, the car was right behind him, almost as if it was anticipating his every move. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, his heart sinking when he saw the headlights getting brighter. Whoever was following him wasn't backing off. The streets were empty, the only sound being the hum of the engine and the screech of tires as Shaq pushed his car faster. He had no destination in mind, just the desperate need to get away, to shake whoever was following him. But the farther he went, the more it felt like the walls were closing in. It didn't matter how fast he drove. He couldn't escape this feeling of being trapped. His phone buzzed again, a sound that felt almost sinister at this point. He pulled it out of his pocket, his hands trembling as he unlocked the screen. Another message from the same unknown number. "They're closer than you think." Shaq's stomach dropped. He couldn't afford to read these messages anymore. Every time he did, it only made him feel more paranoid, more out of control. But it was as if the messages were taunting him, reminding him that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape. He turned down a dark alley, hoping to lose the car behind him. The tires squealed as he took the corner too quickly, his heart in his throat. But as he straightened out, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were more cars ahead of him, 3 of them, parked in a line, blocking the alley. They weren't there before. Had they been waiting for him? Shaq's instincts screamed at him to turn around, but before he could make another move, the car behind him caught up. It didn't try to pass. It just stayed there, a looming presence in the dim light of the alley. He could feel the pressure building inside him, the walls closing in. He slammed his hand on the steering wheel in frustration, unsure of what to do next. There was no way out. He couldn't go forward, and the car behind him wouldn't let him go back. It was as if he were surrounded on all sides, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. Suddenly, the door of one of the parked cars opened, and a figure stepped out. Shaq's eyes widened as the figure began to walk toward him. It was one of the men from the restaurant. The same cold stare, the same purposeful steps. Shaq's heart skipped a beat. He knew this wasn't good. He didn't know who these men were or what they wanted, but he could feel the danger closing in with every passing second. He needed to think quickly. There was no time to waste. He put the car in reverse and hit the gas, slamming into the car behind him. The impact made a loud crunching sound, but Shaq didn't hesitate. He slammed the car into drive and sped forward, tearing out of the alley. His tires screeched as they gripped the road, but he didn't dare look back. As he raced down the streets, the sound of engines revving behind him made his stomach churn. He wasn't alone. They were still following him. And this time, they were gaining speed. Shaq's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel as he pushed the car harder, trying to outrun the group that was closing in on him. The streets blurred past in a haze, and the city lights seemed to flicker and fade into the darkness as he drove deeper into unfamiliar areas. He didn't know where he was going. All he knew was that he had to keep moving. He couldn't let them catch him. Not yet. But no matter how fast he drove, no matter how many twists and turns he took, the cars behind him stayed on his tail. They were relentless. It felt like no matter how hard he tried to outrun them, the danger was always just a step behind. Shaq's mind was racing, his thoughts bouncing from one possibility to the next. Was this really just a random set of events? Or was there something bigger at play? The boy's warning echoed in his mind. They're coming for you. Was it true? Were they really after him? And if so, why? He needed answers. He needed to find out who was behind all of this before it was too late. But the more he tried to escape, the more it seemed like the world was closing in around him. No matter where he went, the danger was right on his heels. Shaq's hands were trembling as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing faster than his car. The streets blurred around him as he tried to lose the cars behind him. But no matter how many turns he took, they kept up with him. He could hear the engines growling behind him, closer than ever. The tension was unbearable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. His phone buzzed again, but this time, he didn't look at it. He couldn't afford to get distracted. Every moment counted. His thoughts were spinning, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The strange boy, the cryptic messages, the men from the restaurant. It was all too much. What did they want from him? Why was he being followed? What was going on? His mind flashed to the boy's words. They're coming for you. It felt like the boy had known something, like he had been trying to warn him all along. But now, Shaq was stuck in the middle of something he didn't understand, and there was no way to turn back. He glanced in the rearview mirror once again. The car behind him was getting closer. They weren't giving up. Panic bubbled up inside him, but he fought to stay calm. He couldn't let fear take control. He needed to think. He needed to figure out what to do next. Suddenly, he saw a light ahead, a sign that the city was getting closer. Maybe he could lose them in the busy streets. Shaq floored the accelerator, praying he could outrun them. The car behind him followed without hesitation, its headlights blinding in the mirror. They were too close now, and the road ahead was filled with more cars. He couldn't risk causing a scene, but he knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. As he approached an intersection, Shaq's mind raced for options. He could turn, try to shake them, but the cars behind him would know. They had been following his every move. They were relentless. In that moment, he realized he had no choice. He had to confront whatever this was head-on. Shaq turned onto a side road, leaving the main highway behind. The cars followed. He wasn't sure how much longer he could outrun them. His hands were sweating, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. The pressure was building, and he could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. He had to stop running. Shaq knew that now. The question was, how? Who could he turn to? Was there anyone who could help him make sense of all this? As he rounded another corner, he saw a familiar sight, a small, dimly lit parking lot. He knew it was risky, but maybe this was his best chance. He drove into the lot, parking behind a row of cars to try and hide. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was his heavy breathing. The only thing he could hear was his racing heartbeat. He sat there, waiting, his eyes glued to the rearview mirror, hoping the cars behind him wouldn't notice where he had gone. But as the minutes ticked by, The quiet was broken by the sound of tires screeching against the pavement. The first of the cars from before entered the parking lot, slowly creeping through the rows of vehicles. Shaq held his breath. His heart was in his throat. He needed to stay calm. He needed to think. The car moved past him, but it didn't stop. Shaq exhaled slowly, a moment of relief washing over him. But then, to his horror, he saw another car pull in, this time a black sedan with tinted windows. It stopped a few rows away from his car. Shaq's mind raced. Was this the end? Were they finally going to corner him? He wasn't sure how much longer he could stay hidden, but he couldn't risk making a move until he knew what was going on. The black sedan's engine turned off, and the world seemed to freeze. He knew the men had been looking for him, but now they were here. Shaq could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his body tense and ready to act. He didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but he couldn't let them get to him. Not without answers. For the first time, Shaq realized that he wasn't just running from these people. He was running from the truth. And he had no choice but to face it now.